Hi, this is Fritz with Against Psychiatry and AgainstPsychiatry.com, and this is the 7th installment of me reading from two articles from a two-article zine-lit. If you missed the previous installments, you should go look for them, and if you can't find them, you should just go to our website, and both the articles are there in text form, and so is a bunch of other great information. The URL for the website is www.againstpsychiatry.com. Okay, so I'm going to pick up with the paragraph where I left off, and here we go. One particularly troubling social phenomenon enabled both by the psychiatric industry takeover of social services and by the increasing acceptance of the psychiatric industry by folks who identify and pass as radical is the sight of these radicals, many of whom are queer and trans punks, taking an active role in psychiatric abuse of people who they may not view as community members. At drop-in centers, clinics, shelters, and even inside the locked gates of psychiatric institutions, radical-identified folks are actively dispensing toxic drugs to marginalized populations, promoting the eugenics-based philosophy that claims that emotional pain and social deviance are caused by biological defects. How can I take an anti-authoritarian feminist activist seriously when their job involves telling teenage sexual abuse survivors at a homeless shelter that their pain is the result of a genetically inherited chemical imbalance in the brain, and then forcing them to take drugs in exchange for housing? How can I sit around a table and plan a political action with a radical queer whose night job includes preventing people like me from escaping the psychiatric facility where they are being held against their will? Services such as showers, needle exchange, and medical care are vital resources, and I don't mean to suggest that radical folks are mistaken in their effort to help provide them, but they need to be aware when the social service agencies they work for are promoting psychiatric abuse as a tool for gentrification. Homelessness and mental illness are increasingly used as synonyms. In the public consciousness, poverty is yet again being redefined as something genetic and biologically based. As urban centers which once possessed ample affordable housing and vibrant underground economies gentrify, marginalized queers and artists who cannot or will not work full-time are left with few options to avoid inflated rents. No longer able to scrape together money for communal housing in cities like San Francisco and New York, many queers and creative folks are engaged in a desperate struggle to get off or stay off of the streets. Because other public assistance programs have been slashed, people who would normally avoid the psychiatric system are increasingly pressured into accepting psychiatric diagnosis in exchange for a paltry Social Security checks. Though they often secretly refuse to take the drugs prescribed to them in private, the constant psychiatric surveillance SSI recipients are subjected to makes this survival option a dangerous one. SSI recipients, particularly residents of subsidized housing, are frequently forced to take drugs, or else face the possibility of their benefits being cut, custody of their children denied, or of being institutionalized or kicked out onto the streets. Psychiatrists and social workers call the increasingly popular practice of forcing entry into a victim's home to drug them against their will assisted outpatient treatment. Housing and other basic resources are the carrots that the government dangles in front of socially marginalized populations in order to entice them to accept psychiatric treatment. If the poor refuse to bite, then the ever-helpful social service agencies will return with force. Plans to end homelessness, which negate free will and are based solely on providing housing structured around the ambiguous concept of treatment for substance abuse or mental illness, deny the existence of homeless folks who don't fall into either one of these target categories. Folks who choose to use illegal drugs are denied services unless they learn to think about their drug use as a genetic brain disorder which is out of their control, and to accept medical management of their drug intake with government-approved pharmaceuticals. Homeless folks who aren't already addicts are typically assumed to be mentally ill and then coerced into developing addictions to hazardous psychiatric drugs. supposedly to treat the genetic brain disorders that cause their poverty. People who do not accept being labeled with a genetic brain disorder, or who do not accept that the treatments mandated by various government programs are right for them, are routinely denied access to the resources provided by these programs, such as long-term housing, which is often needed to transition out of homelessness. Even basic services such as showers, meals, and shelter increasingly come wedded to some type of treatment. And some cities may kidnap homeless folks who refuse shelter off the streets with vans that carry them away against their will for psychiatric treatment. Urban social service agencies often recruit homeless folks for experimental studies. I have witnessed this predation play out firsthand at drop-in centers where psychiatric drugs are pushed on exhausted people who are simply overwhelmed while trying to cope with the stress of survival on the streets and a lifetime of traumatic experiences, which often includes a history of psychiatric abuse. It is hard to understand how these drugs could be promoted as universal treatments to restore a person to normality when the brain-damaging side effects of these drugs form so much of the basis for the stigma around what is commonly understood as mental illness. The truth, according to several studies cited by Dr. Peter Breggin in his classic text Toxic Psychiatry, is that more than 60% of people who have been drugged with neuroleptics, commonly referred to as antipsychotics, will develop tardive dyskinesia, a permanent condition of often severe, painful, and disabling spasms and tics. The stereotypical twitchy behavior of a seemingly crazy person, often older and homeless, is in fact not a symptom of a psychiatric disorder, but merely evidence of the harm inflicted by psychiatrists. Meanwhile, tests are being conducted at the University of Pennsylvania with a brain control implant which delivers high doses of neuroleptics subcutaneously, continuously, for up to a year. While sharing experiences with other abuse survivors, a common thread is seen to emerge. Children and adults who survive rape or other abuse are frequently labeled as mentally ill, particularly if they attempt to report the abuse, flee their abusers, or otherwise bring attention to the abuse through emotional reaction to the experiences they have survived. For bringing attention to the abuse, survivors may be drugged, institutionalized, or even subjected to electroshock. Time and time again, I have heard of how psychiatrists and other mental health professionals have sided with abusive families or the notoriously abusive foster care system to silence the victims and allow the abuse to continue. Abusive families and the inherently abusive psychiatric industry form a powerful alliance that is hard for a frightened survivor to escape. As many as 80% of women inpatients in psychiatric facilities report serious physical and/or sexual abuse as children, but there is still considerable confusion and resistance within psychiatry about the relevance and meaning of abuse for understanding and treating psychiatric disorders. Even in those situations where abuse has been acknowledged by authorities, accompanying psychiatrists will still drug and blame the brain of a survivor if they do so much as complain. Based on my personal experience, and the experience of many of my friends, sexual abuse within the psychiatric system is epidemic. Official publications from within the psychiatric system that acknowledge this abuse are sparse compared to the unofficial and undocumented testimonies of socially marginalized survivors. In addition to protecting social norms by silencing abuse survivors, the reluctance on the part of the psychiatric system to honestly address issues of sexual abuse makes much more sense once you know that women with disabilities who live in institutions are twice as likely to be victimized as women who live in the community, and that, although psychiatrists only comprise 6% of physicians in the country, a 1998 review of U.S. Medical Board actions taken for sex-related offenses revealed responsible for a whopping 28% of these sex-related offenses. The connections between sexual abuse and the psychiatric industry were illustrated for me quite graphically when I was 14 years old, incarcerated in a mental institution, forcibly drugged, and sexually assaulted repeatedly by my psychiatrist. Anyway, heavy stuff, but that's the end of this section, and if you are interested in the next section of this article, then find the next section. That would be section 8, because this is section 7. Yeah, anyway, if you can't find it, just go to the website.